Hey, Conrad, how are you?
I'm great. How about yourself? Good to see you.
Doing well, man. It's been a while.
Yeah, man.
Yeah,
Feels great.
welcome to my new podcast and video cast. I'm recording this as we speak, so let's get right down to it. My next guest, in addition to being a professional in the film industry, focused on production efficiency, he is a self-described social philosopher, a designer, a digital storyteller, transhumanist, and an entrepreneur. Conrad T. Curtis. Thank you and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I've seen, we've been friends on Facebook, and I've seen a lot of the posts that you've put on your feed, and I've noticed that a lot of them have very kind of socialistic leanings, if you don't mind me saying so. Am I wrong in assuming that, or?
No, no, not at all. I think that I like to, I don't know, stir the pot and sort of present a perspective on the way the world works that might not be the first thing that people think of.
So, I mean, you were an avid Bernie supporter, am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah, me too. So we have that in common. Do you think capitalism is a great economic system, or do you think there are problems with it? What do you think is gonna?
I think that it's a sort of system that's in decay. It's a system that, it was really powerful for a very long time, but now it's sort of collapsing under its own weight. It did what it promised to do really, really well. And now the price performance of productivity and efficiency is, getting down to these like minute returns. So the sort of normal rules of the game when, Adam Smith's capitalism doesn't really apply anymore. And we're living in an age of what one of the guys who I really, really like to read and look up to, named Jeremy Rifkin, calls a zero marginal cost society. So we're moving into a space that might not be so focused on GDP because those numbers might not make sense. It's not focused on growth in the same way that traditional capitalism or neoliberal thought focuses on growth. So I think it's right now we're facing a sort of a different time than people at the turn of the last century were facing. The same industrial questions are now sort of obsolete to us. So it's definitely it's a changing of the guard, and I think that there's some real conversations that need to be had about like how is this thing working and why is this thing working in the context of the opportunities and problems that we're presented with today.
What do you think of the problems that are presenting us today?
There's huge wealth gaps. There's a lot of money in the control of a very small group of people. There's an allegiance to money as somehow this like real thing that it isn't. I was always under the impression that the purpose of money in any economic system was to circulate goods and services. But if you look at, people like Milton Friedman and these free market philosophers who are saying that, the purpose of money is to get more money and the shareholder theory of value, it starts to get a little squirrely. So that's one thing that I, when I was reaching out to, because the first thing I did when I found out that I was going to be doing this with you is I turned to my little social network and I asked my friends, why do you think young people are turning to Marxism, socialism? And they came back with sort of three groups of responses. The first was the promises that it offers, right? So it's like, oh, if you implement these socialist philosophies, you're going to get universal health care and you're going to get access to free education and you're going to get, all of these things that you're promised, right? And then another vertical was sort of realities we're facing. It's, we're broke, we're in debt, we have shitty health care that's really expensive. And then the third sort of group of people basically said that people who are interested in socialism don't understand what it is. And that's either in the form of the lexicon or, like the words that we use to describe things or just blatant misinformation. So I was kind of looking at these three groups of things, and there was three quotes that I wanted to pull really quick.
Go right ahead.
From people. But one of them, who's an older gentleman, said, in my opinion, the ugly truth is that they're broke, and when you're broke, socialism sounds better. I was like, okay, that sure. Another one says, with my VA benefits and GI Bill, I have free tuition and healthcare. I can also take advantage of a VA loan. It's possible now. You just have to join the service and you're set. Which, that's her reality. That's what she is in the opportunity to do. And I know people who have served who have access to housing and healthcare that are not available to most people. And then I had another friend who said that an idea that socialism involves a collaborative government who prioritizes funding that serves the people. I think our generation is attracted to the outlines of socialist concepts because we are lacking so much of the benefits, whether that be healthcare, low-income safety nets, the maternity or long-term military service benefits, lower wage gaps. In terms of technology, I cannot speak to, but I also lack the trust in the United States government to successfully implement socialist policies. So that one really stood out to me. It's like, whoa, you really got all your ducks in a row, and that was something that I really really heard and sort of was an easy way to explain a lot of the feelings that I've had. But I think that we're a generation that's growing up in the wake of neoliberalism, which is not something most people even understand, let alone are willing to talk about. We're growing up in the information age. And we're growing up with an exposure to ecosystems in a way that stretches beyond, save the trees. So there's lots of deforestation and horrible things going on around the world, and on the belief that, well, the free market says so, so it's okay. But the biggest thing when on the topic of, why are young people being drawn to Marxism, socialism, is that we've grown up, and this is strictly speaking for Americans, is grown up in post-Soviet era. There's been no threat of socialism. There's been no threat of communism toppling, our everyday existence. And I think it's allowed young people to kind of re-examine the thoughts and ideas from a different perspective, one that might not be so knee-jerk, flag-waving, scared.
Right.
So
one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of people are for socialism when it comes to healthcare. I mean, universal healthcare, that's one of the first things. I'm a big advocate for universal healthcare. However, a few days ago, a friend of ours was required medical service, emergency room service and or care, and he had Medi-Cal, and they basically just kept him in the emergency room and kind of forgot about him. You know what I mean? Because he's not a priority. I mean, I'm not saying that they were negligent. However, definitely looks that way. But I'm just saying it's not really surprising to see that. I've heard similar stories of, in the UK, you have a lot of people who are just waiting maybe a year or two for some kind of a transplant, some kind of a surgery, because the waiting list is so long. They do, move people around depending on the severity of the illness, but it's like, I don't know. You have access to great care here if you can afford it, but what really pisses me off, and I think really needs to be changed, is even if you can't afford it, you get mediocre care, and you most probably will have to file for bankruptcy because of that mediocre care. So it's like, we need to fix that part of the system. Why do you think? How old are you, by the way?
I'm 27.
Okay, so you're 27. I've noticed that I looked this up. There was a 2016 Reason Group survey, and it found that 53% of Americans under the age of 30 had a favorable view of socialism, as opposed to less than a third of those over 30. And I think you're right. We are living in a post-Soviet era. People have seemed to have forgotten the atrocities that were committed in the old Soviet Union. I think what we really need to do is we need to differentiate between socialist democracy, communism, Marxism, because those are all different forms of government. And what we're talking about is socialism, where, everybody kind of, you have a big government and it kind of is supposed to distribute the wealth somewhat evenly, but it doesn't always work that way. You know what I mean? You always
Yeah,
have.
I think that one of the biggest things in terms of the lexicon and the ways that people talk about things, is we're looking at big and small government. People talk about big and small government, but they don't talk about bloated and lean government. They don't talk about using exponential technologies to decrease the size of something, but increase its productivity. They don't talk about the ways that if you were to apply a lot of the technologies that are behind Facebook and Google and these big for-profit institutions to healthcare, you start to see costs drop and you start to see efficiency go up. I have friends who work for companies who use predictive analytics to say this is a time that a certain patient needs to be brought in because they're exhibiting this, and this signs. These are all things that we are facing in an age of information. We're facing in an age of connectivity. We're seeing the price performance and productivity across the board, really rock traditional business models, but at the same time, we're claiming that things only exist to generate profit. So there's definitely a big contradiction between the two. And I think that, one of the foundations and underpinnings of Marxism is talking about contradictions, and it's looking for and looking at contradictions. And I don't think that there is an academic out there who would discredit like Marx and Engels' analysis of the way that industrial capitalism worked. That was a huge, huge text at the time that really took another frame and held it up against industrial capitalism. But at the same time, the world that we're living in today looks nothing like the world of industrial capitalism. So to think that, if we bring in social policies that we're going to get, height of the Soviet Union, boogeyman oppression, like those two things are not even relevant. Right now, you're seeing around the world the ripple and effects of, imperialist capitalism that are just as horrendous. I mean, you see things that really start to make you look at numbers and look at amounts of people and look at damage that's been done. And it's like, okay, well, you can look at both sides and realize that both sides aren't perfect. Both sides have had their times, but it has more to do with authoritarianism and democracy than it has to do with the way that it organized their resources. So I don't think that I know anybody who wants to live under an authoritarian dictatorship. I've never met that person who thinks that that's the best idea. And I know a lot of people who seem like anarchists by the way that they talk, but they call themselves libertarians. And it's like, it's an interesting sort of predicament where it's like the words that we use to describe things are so out of date, or they're related to things that have been expressed fully, so that people start attaching all these ideas and thoughts and beliefs to them before you can even have a conversation about things. Really is it's something that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be a way of looking at these things as what's the best path forward. Because I don't know anybody who thinks that capitalism or communism or these isms are going to be the foundation for the next great society, but we do have an innate desire to be social and to be collaborative and to be connected. And I think we're living in a time that's really building this manifestation of the collective consciousness that is the internet. We're growing something that's living, that's breathing, that's a reflection of us. So I don't see a future where people want to disconnect from each other, where people want to pull these plugs that we've been laying down. One of my favorite quotes was, Eric Schmidt said, "We create as much information every 2 days as all of human civilization created up to 2003. And that was in 2003, when there were 719 million people on the internet. Now there's 3.9 billion. We're creating information at a breakneck speed. I don't think going backwards from that is going to be something that people are willing to do. So, you have people who have information at their fingertips. They have truth at their fingertips. They have connectivity at their fingertips. And it's something that is not going to be, slowed down because of Donald Trump being president or Vladimir Putin being, his leader. It's those types of things are not going to stand in the way of the kinds of innovations that are creating the society that everybody feels like we have the ability and deserve to live in.
Right. Well, I mean, the one thing I would say to that is the only reason Facebook and the internet have come into being is because of capitalism. I mean, if we were able to capitalize on our healthcare more, yeah, I mean, we do in a way have a kind of mixed capitalism and socialism together in the GoFundMe things. You have GoFundMe for people get sick, and you have this page that goes up and people can donate money. That's a socialist route to go, somewhat. But
is it though? Is it? I mean, and when you say, it's funny, I find it really interesting. And sorry to interrupt.
No,
when you
please.
say that the internet was created by capitalism.
No, it was the Department of Defense.
What was that?
It was the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it was publicly funded.
Right.
And most of the technologies that are in your cell phones or that are, the foundation, if you think about, the actual machine languages that run our computer systems around the world on servers, more complex than you could imagine, those are open source platforms. Like the idea that capitalism has generated these things is sort of nonsensical. It doesn't really line up with the reality that we're living in. But in fact, during the Clinton administration, there was a lot of conversation about the internet because it's this new thing, and they came to the conclusion that it needed to be privatized because that was the only thing that was going to spur innovation. But as a result, we were going to end up with something that was inherently monopolistic and went against the sort of natural laws of capitalism that make it run. They said, well, it's better to put up with some short-term monopolies in exchange for an incentive for people to work with this thing. But that was something that, the Zero Marginal Cost Society book, I really would recommend it because it does a great job at reframing the history of socioeconomic evolution from the lens of technology. And that really is a foundation that if you don't factor in, the entire conversation has no real footing. Like the way that people talk about social and economic change now is really deeply rooted into technology. So if you don't understand those kind of exponential technologies and exponential trends, it's easy to say that the impossible is impossible.
Well, I mean, back to your point, the Department of Defense really had no other use of the internet other than communicating with, bases around the country. But it was the capitalist system that kind of said, hey, we can figure out new ways to use this. This is awesome. And so it kind of led to the birth of the computer industry and Silicon Valley. But I don't think it would be anywhere near where it is now if it wasn't for capitalism. I am well aware that capitalism has done innumerable atrocities throughout human history. I think, however, that socialism is responsible for at least as many. And but unfortunately, what I see happening with the advancement of artificial intelligence, maybe I've seen too many movies like The Matrix, but I do kind of think that we're heading towards a situation. Why are we, investing so much capital into AI, so much research into AI? I think it's because there's a need to have a flawless performance in the completion of jobs or tasks, and more automation is coming. Also, because what we're going to do is we're going to stop the worker who has maybe has a hangover, maybe they're going through a breakup or whatever. They're not going to be able, maybe they're ill, and they're not going to be able to perform at their best. Plus, they can't really collectivize, if you can just pull the plugs on them. You know what I mean? That could be an incentive to go the more automated route. I don't think once automation has reached a certain point, I don't think there's going to be any other choice other than to go a socialistic route.
Yeah, and that's something that is Kevin Kelly, who's one
Yeah.
of one of the founders of Wired, wrote a book that came out last year, 2 years ago maybe now, called The Inevitable, and it's about the 12 technological forces that are shaping our future. And he points out that when he started researching for this book, he was full-on gung-ho capitalist, and by the time that he went through the ways that these technologies behave, he couldn't ignore their inherent horizontal nature. There's another, I don't know if you've read much Ray Kurzweil, but he's a proponent, thought leader in technology, like the kind that the
leading
world has
towards
never
immortality.
seen, right? And he had something that he posted last year in support of a universal basic income. And he made a point to say, that in the United States, there's a muddle of things that approximate a UBI in the form of food stamps, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, emergency rooms, and other programs. But he also went on to say that, we are clearly headed towards a situation where everyone can live very well with the support that society will provide. The fantastic price performance gains we've seen in information technology is coming to physical products, food, energy, and other material items as they all become information technologies, like 3D printing, vertical agriculture, and solar energy. So there's a lot of really smart people who are at the forefront of these revolutions who say, hey, this is the way that these things behave. And if we want to keep the wheels turning, if we want to keep goods and services circulating, we're going to have to figure out another way, because right now this isn't working. And I think that that's something that is at the heart of why young people are so confused that the world is operating the way that it is now. I mean, I remember being a kid and watching the transformation of the music industry and not understanding that from a perspective of the way that things used to be. It's just like, oh yeah, all of my music that I could have ever wanted is accessible online for free. Like, this is normal. And that pace and that change has never stopped. So it does seem kind of strange to a person like me who sees the advancement in automation and doesn't see society preparing itself for large-scale technological unemployment. And I'm somebody who, my dad twice had to go through technological unemployment. First, he worked as a steel worker, and then the steel mills went away. And then he worked for the phone company. In the last 6 years that he was working at the phone company before he retired, he was uninstalling payphones. So it's like, this is a person who, lived hands-on through technological unemployment. And you sit here and you think, oh, a robot could never do my job, but nothing could be farther from the truth. Most of the things that we do today, they can do better. And Jack Ma from Alibaba, Chinese bajillionaire, he was saying just recently, that we have to start training people to do different things. We shouldn't be competing with machines. We should be human. And machines will be machines. You can't out-machine a machine. Like, there's no way. The phone, the computer in your pocket is so much more powerful at arithmetic and data management than your brain. There's no reason to compete with that. So we're facing very uncertain times, and I think if we wait around for the free market and invisible hand to figure it out, you're going to end up with a lot of people living in not so noble conditions.
Well, are you aware? I think it was the city of Stockton has just implemented a universal income test run where they're giving everybody $500 a month, no questions asked, as long as you have, you live within the zip code of Stockton, California. I'm interested to see how that turns out. I mean, a lot of people don't really realize that we do have a bit of socialism already at play in America in the form of Social Security. That's you take money from your paycheck and you put it at the end of your life, and then you will get monthly payments. or disbursements based on what you've paid into it. I think that's a great system. But one of the things that capitalism tends to do is it always tends to, and I think this is the reason why young people are so disillusioned with it, is that it tends to always look at profit before, moral. Is it moral? Is it going to harm more people in the long run? Those are things that capitalists tend to, discard. But one thing I've noticed is that socialism and communism, going back to at least the 1960s, it's always been kind of alluring to youth. It's always been, like you have the hippie movement. They were living in communes, and you have people who, but they were living in communes until they started to make loads and loads of money, like Jerry Rubin, I think he was the Chicago 7. He was a big time activist, and then he started to make money in investments in the 1980s, and he became fabulously wealthy. Kind of, a little bit of hypocrisy there. So
a lot of the people who were fortunate enough to participate in the hippie movement started out with money. So that was a whole ethos of turn in, turn off, tune in, turn off, and unplug, whatever Timothy Leary tried to spin. But that was that was a fortunate ethos of that time. At the same time, you were also having work and labor across the country that had never been so widespread and existed before. Being able to work in a factory and having a decent paying job was a thing that was real. But then you're right, like in the 80s, there was, greed is good and insane amounts of money were made. And that was the first time that, big money was supposed to yield trickle down economics. And we learned real quick that wasn't something that was terribly real, that never happened. We're still waiting for it to trickle down, right?
Right. Well, one thing that I don't hear a lot of people bringing up as often as it should be brought up is that the fact that the Defense Department takes officially about $600 billion a year. Unofficially, it's well over $1 trillion. And then you hear these things every once in a while. Oh, the Pentagon cannot account for $1 trillion or $2 trillion. These are things. Pretty soon you're starting to talk about real money. A couple trillion here, a couple trillion there. So I think we could have very good, social safety nets if we could, get the military-industrial complex under control. Unfortunately, they have nuclear weapons, and they have all the weapons, and I don't think they're going to give up control of that very easily. But let's say we do cast a wider safety net, but we don't have all of the AI systems in place to take over take over the jobs. Is the fact that all of our basic monetary needs are met, or a lot of them are met, is that going to destroy the workplace? Are people not just going to lose interest in working altogether? Do you think?
That was okay. So I find that idea fascinating because I was fortunate enough to grow up in a super privileged environment. The schools that I was able to go to were full of people who had a lot of money, and I always noticed that these people who were incredibly successful and worked incredibly hard were also people who were given cars on their 16th birthday, who were people who were, they had a roof over their head. Their parents paid for them to have an apartment in college. Like, these were all things that the baseline, idea of if you're supported, you'll thrive makes sense. But I've never really understood the idea that people need to work hard for their money. And if you don't have an incentive to work hard, I went to art school for 8 years. These are a lot of people who have accepted the fact that I'm not going to be making much money. They're pursuing something because they're passionate. And I work on movies. I've worked on $150 million movies. I've worked on $9 million movies, $300,000 movies, and there's a sweet spot where people are making good money, working decent hours, being treated like human beings, but are working on things that they care about and things that are important to them. And those people work harder than anybody I've ever met in my entire life.
Yeah.
I don't understand, people who work at these mega institutions and make $500,000 a year who sit on their desk and, they figure out ways to extend their life at a company. Like, that doesn't make sense in the narrative either. So there's not much of a foundation when people say that, if you increase a safety net, that people will, be lazy and throw their life away. But if working every day is a problem, I'd be happy to work less so that I could pursue things that I'm passionate about. It's like, people don't sit around. If you have the time and you have a skill set, or you have the ability to learn things, I don't know many people who sit around and do nothing. I know people who do that because they're too tired from working too much.
Right. I mean, you really have to have something that you're passionate about in order to do it well, consistently, and over a prolonged period of time. But if I guess what I'm trying to say is, passion has to be innate. And you're right. If people are given everything, they have the time to focus on other interests. So I guess my point is...
Sorry, I don't know that one.
Oh, sorry. Did
Alexa thinks that we're talking to her.
Oh, wow.
No, stop. Go away.
Sweat.
Yeah, no
Well,
sweat.
I'm glad Alexa actually stepped in there, because that brings up Amazon. Amazon kind of, you have peak capitalism or endgame capitalism. I think it's reached the point where certain avenues of capitalistic ventures, like retail, we've kind of reached the end stages of them, and I think Amazon won. I don't see them going anywhere. I see, in fact, are brick and mortar stores closing shop, and I think that capitalism would ultimately be better than, socialism if it was actually fair. If there were ways to compete legitimately. But I don't see that anymore. I see people who have more money use that money in order to maintain their position in the market. And I don't see capitalism as, changing in that respect. But the thing about socialism is that, whenever my brother-in-law went down to Cuba recently, when they opened it to tourists, and he noticed that all of the cars are from the 1950s because there was no planned obsolescence. There was, if something broke, you fixed it. And that's just the way things were. They don't have a gear mechanism that they need to keep grinding in order to keep churning out profits. I think that's very alluring, but I don't know. There are just so many things that we could focus on. One of them being that if people didn't have work to focus on, what would they do with themselves?
That's a question that, particularly in the context of, us having a conversation right now, what would you do with yourself? I know that I've been doing, when I have free time, I'm doing so much with myself. I'm going, looking at art, learning things, taking classes online, starting a company that's trying to completely reorganize the way that we do our work. I travel. I get to, I took a month-long trip into the Canadian Rockies last year. There's so much to do, and we live in a place, in an environment where all of those things are possible. And I just, from the creative space and, dealing with people who I deal with on a day-to-day, the amount of productivity that is not registered in my W-2, the amount that's not on my tax return, the things that I do because they're things that I love to do, those are things that I think should be celebrated. And I think those are things that people would do. We're not in a society with people who, contrary to economic theory and the economic beliefs of, the mid-Americas, the 1950 to 1970, there was this real ethos that people were just motivated by money. and that they'll do whatever they can in their self-interest to maximize their money is an economic law that doesn't have any relation to the real physical world or the way that people really operate. So I don't think that the fear of not knowing what people would do with themselves if they worked less, I don't think that that's something that I'm really afraid of. I think that we've always found something new to do. Mm-hmm. You know, there's always new insights and new developments, and the speed that things are changing. There's opportunities just purely on the basis of like needing time to go back to school. You know, the average person changes total career paths, like 5-6 times in their life now. That's a lot of time that you need to gather your thoughts and learn new things and learn new skills and go new places. Like, these are not things that, I don't know, people should necessarily be afraid of. I mean, if you told me I had to work 4 days a week, I would lose it. I would be so excited. You know, if I worked 8-hour days, I work 14, 16, 20-hour days. You know, I clock crazy hours, but I think that we could do better and less.
Right.
I think that a lot of the time we spend as an American worker is slaving away to show some sort of weird masochistic drive to deserve to live.
Right. Well, I mean,
that's never really been a motivator of human society.
Right. I'm not religious in any way, but do you think the rise in socialism has anything to do with the fact that the Protestant work ethic, you know, and religion in general is playing less and less of a role in our lives nowadays? I mean,
for sure, and the illusion that, you know, we are somehow bound, our moral worth is bound to our material wealth is something that, you know, we're shown in the United States. People try to paint that picture, but it's not something that is relatable to the day-to-day interactions and conversations we have, you know. And I don't think that necessarily, I think that a big problem when you talk about the Soviet implementation of Marxism was this sincere and maniacal aversion to organized religion. And at the time, you know, there was, especially in Russia, there was huge influence from the church. So it made sense to say, we will have none of this. But I think that people, you know, are inherently spiritual. We're inherently connected to each other. We're inherently connected to something greater than ourselves. And that's something that I personally see in the way that this technology is coming into our lives and is changing things. Like, I have an attachment to that as my spirituality, and I look down into those kinds of things. But if whatever your spiritual needs are, usually those things are not tied to, you know, your productive output. Right. That's not something that makes you a good person spiritually. That's not something that makes you a positive contribution to society.
Well, I mean, whenever it comes to people working because they need to take care of themselves or they need to take care of a family, if they were given, you know, more time off, it sounds like, I mean, I could be wrong, but it sounds like a lot of that time would be spent selfishly. Am I wrong? It'd be like we let's go hiking rather than building a community center for everybody. We would just go and focus on being the best possible version of us we could possibly be.
I don't know if that's true, because there's a sort of, and obviously it's all in a world of what ifs, so we don't know. Mm-hmm. But there's definitely is something to be connected between the neoliberal ideology and the idea that, you know, it's almost a Newtonian perspective. Everything is made of little itty bitty parts, and all of these parts are doing their individual things. And I'm an individual, and you're an individual. And Milton Friedman wrote Capitalism and Freedom, and there's like something to be said about me being a free entity in this space. But, you know, the quantum perspective, the social perspective is understanding that all of these things are interrelated. And I think if you start to rework the levers and you start to move people away from thinking about, you know, I need to make money and get rich for myself, and more, how can we create a rich society? How can we create a rich culture? Then you start to really dive in and say, okay, we have an aging population that we've never seen before. You know, this is a lot of people who are going to be living a lot longer. maybe we need to come together and build some community centers. Maybe we need to figure out ways to get these people interacting with each other and out of the house. Like these are all things that if you take an objective look at these are the needs of the society, you'll be able to create these things. And another person who was commenting on my original post was talking about, the fact that 90% of the world's, what did you say, like 90% of the world's population keeps their wealth in things that are not recognized by Western capitalism. So caring for others, family members, caring for, elders caring for children, like communities that are not attached to P&L sheets. Like this is something that is a natural, normal human understanding. The fact that everybody lives in their house and pays for everything is a relatively new development. So I don't know if there would be a dive into selfishness if you were having people work less or be less attached to formal capitalism. I don't think that the human experience really lends itself to promoting that idea.
Okay, well, one thing you said earlier, do you think we can avoid or will avoid, if we choose to go the more collectivist route, do you think we'll avoid making the same mistakes that were made in the past when implementing collectivism? Like, we don't have enough food for everybody, so we're going to have 6 or 7 million people starve. Stuff like that. Those are atrocious.
So under capitalism, 50% of the food that's grown and created ends up in trash. So there's more efficient ways to organize the existing infrastructure that is not necessarily going to mean that you end up with an authoritarian dictatorship. It's like, I think that my goal and the sort of light at the end of the tunnel that I see would be a distributed, direct digital democracy. Like right now we live in a republic, right? There's no, it's a common misconception in the United States that people think we live in a democracy, but we don't. We live in a republic. Like that is like a foundational part of it. And the other foundational parts of it were that this was a country designed to promote for the first time, the protection of private capital. Like this country was founded by mercantilists and the first generation of entrepreneurs who saw private wealth as a thing that was something that was needed to be protected. So we created a state to enforce private property laws. That is the foundation and exercise our freedom, which was attached to those same ideals. So I think that there's something inherently contradictory about the idea that socializing things or creating horizontal environments are going to lead to a dictatorship, when dictatorships are formed when there's consolidations of power. So the consolidations of power under modern capitalism, we're seeing less and less people own more and more things, and we're living in a world that the United States. There was a Princeton article about, I want to say 2014,
oligarchy,
that showed that the United States was an oligarchy and not a democracy. And like, that's something that's out in the open, right? So I think that if we were to approach it from a perspective of we're all connected nodes in this giant network, and if we can engage those nodes efficiently and effectively and sustainably, we can create a civilization that is working for the will of the people and not for the will of the few.
Well, I mean, that sounds beautiful, but if I was to say, Conrad, we need to house everybody in your neighborhood equally, so we're going to have to move you and your family out of your home. It sounds good on paper, this stuff, but whenever you start to implement it, that's when the tyranny comes in, and that's when there are all of the horror stories.
But there's more vacant homes than homeless people.
That's a good point.
Like that's
a good point.
The contradictions abound, right? It's like you can say that it's scary when somebody's coming at you with a gun saying that you have to do what you have to do, but that's something that is we're looking at a time that's just as possible for that to happen under capitalism. Like the institutions that are in power right now are starting to speak in similar sorts of ways. And I don't think that there is I don't think that there is a case to be made for a lack of organization on the grounds that somebody's gonna, if you organize, that somebody's gonna come and knock down your door and tell you how to change the way you live your life. Like that's just something that I think was a ramification of the organizational infrastructure at the time. You know, when you talk about the turn of the century, last century, you have a sort of budding managerial class and an understanding of organization that was very vertically integrated, and that was how you created success at the time. Now, the sort of feedback loops and data-driven decision making is more in tune with, you know, being honest and being objective and saying, okay, what's working, what's not. If you look at these handbooks, you know, entrepreneurial handbooks like the Lean Startup, it's all about this build, measure, learn feedback loop. And right now in post-industrial capitalism, you have a society that's very much concentrate. And whatever we're doing, our 5-year plan, our 10-year plan, like this thing is going to keep us alive for as long as it does until that company gets toppled by another company that doesn't really perceive the same way. So there's an opportunity in leveraging what we know to be best practices about the way to design for sustainability and for growth that are conducive to the technologies that we have. I don't see people, the only people I see trying to go backwards are people trying to stick to what's working right now. You know, you got people who are in office here and around the globe who want to go towards monopolies, because that's the natural progression of the way that capitalism works.
Right.
And vertical integration makes a lot of sense if you're trying to get really, really rich and cut down marginal costs. But when marginal costs no longer exist because things are being 3D printed, or you have clean energy that's renewable, like those don't line up very well with the strategies and technologies that existed 100 years ago.
I mean, I think you have a great point. We do have all of the infrastructure in place to have kind of a utopia here in the United States. Unfortunately, I don't think it can be done bloodlessly, because the people who have control of all the distribution methods, they're not going to give that power up voluntarily. You know what I mean? They're not going to say, well, you're right, this system is better than we had. So, and plus they also have massive contributions to the politicians. And so they've in essence bought them. So I think if any step that the United States takes towards kind of a socialist utopia, it's going to be met with a very loud, scary boogeyman in the form of, this is what happened in the Soviet Union, and it's a real boogeyman. It actually happened. These are horrendous things that have happened. We shouldn't, forget them. I just don't think that. I don't know. I just don't think that capitalism it can go on forever, because I think capitalism does ultimately end in totalitarianism.
Yeah, there's a British Indian writer and thinker named Arpam Dut, who wrote early 20th century, and he talks about this idea that you won't see a forcible overthrow of capitalism if you have a certain baseline of prosperity. Like that violent revolution isn't going to happen. And back to Marx and Engels, they talked about this idea of you have the stages or the phases that we're going through, and they talk about socialism as the 5th stage, and communism as the 6th stage, and that's the sort of all beautiful, sunshine and rainbows utopia that people talk about. We've never seen a communist state because it hasn't existed, just this attempted happening. But when they talk about the withering away of the state, which is something that is an inevitability, that once you get through this dictatorship of the proletariat, you end up with a withering away of the state, and that state that disappears is something that you get communists and you get libertarians in the same room and you say, what's the end goal? It's like, oh, get rid of the state, have this free, amazing place for people to live in. So it's funny that those two things are seen as like violent oppositions. But what Marx and Engels didn't really think about, and what Arpon Dut didn't really think about, what Ray Kurzweil has, given us the gift of, is the law of accelerating returns, and that's the exponential trends in information technology. So when I look at these things over time, and I look at where Arpon Dut was sitting, he wrote this book in 1932, and then he put it out again in 1933 because he said, hey, this fascism thing is like super real, which obviously we know how that went down. But what they didn't really get to think about was this fact that technological change doesn't stop because of wars. It doesn't stop because of famine. It doesn't stop. There's no natural force that slows it down when you look at these exponential trends over time. So I think that we really are working towards the withering away of the state, if you will. We just never had a phase of industrial socialism. So if that makes sense, like I think that where we're getting and the technologies and things that are making these things possible is it doesn't necessarily seem to be a thing or an entity that's dependent on any sort of violent revolution. It's more dependent on self-evident truths. It's more dependent on this idea that we're looking at things or we're seeing things that said, hey, this is something that these technologies could organize way better than we can. Let's lean on them. Let's let them do that. Let's create, maybe not a utopia. Let's not chase utopia. Like, let's just create something that makes sense. We have tools. Throughout the history of humanity, we have not, told our tools what they were going to make our societies. The tools dictated how the societies move forward. So these are just brain extenders. We're in a time where we have amazing brain extenders and we're able to do amazing things. So why not be amazing?
Well, with that, if you have anything else to add, I can't add anything to that. It sounds like a pretty good sum up.
No, man, I appreciate you taking the time. I'm really excited and want people to be talking about this stuff more and not in a online forum way. Like, I don't know what the solution is. I don't know what, I just read books that I like on the weekends. Like, I have people in my life who are very, very informed and, push me forward. And I just want to see more of those communities building. So, if this is something that's important to you, it's important to me. Like, I would love to keep the conversation going in any capacity, whatever.
Absolutely.
If anybody wants to reach out to me, like, I'd be happy to talk.
Yeah, I appreciate it. One of the things that I see is that we've kind of reached the conclusion, at least in the media, that their collectivism in any form is going to be bad, and we shouldn't even try it. And a good case can be made for that, but I don't know. I think that we can at least talk about it and reach some kind of a intellectual understanding. Whether that understanding can be translated into the real world application is a different story. But I do think that we do need to take these things seriously, and we need to talk about them more frequently and more optimistically. I don't want to say, I hate whenever I hear people say we're doomed. Like, as a species, we're just doomed.
It's a more exciting time than ever to be alive.
I agree.
These things are happening. If you look around the world, you look at the way that, people are implementing technology, it's happening now. And there's no shortage. I think we definitely need some better news outlets and sources that sort of feed us positive information. I think that would be wonderful. But it is happening, and there's exciting roads ahead.
I appreciate it, Conrad. Conrad T. Curtis, do they have any way to get in touch with you, or any portfolio or any way that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram as Conrad T. Circuits. You can find me on Facebook, Conrad Curtis, or reach out directly, ConradTCurtis@gmail.com. Happy to talk.
Awesome. Conrad T. Curtis, thank you again. Take care.